A bare table, hard light. Allied interrogators sat Alfred Jodl across from them and switched on the lights. He had waited nearly a year for that room. Germany had already fallen. Hitler was dead. The flags were gone, and the rallies were history. By then, Jodl had spent 12 years turning Hitler's plans into military orders. Not speeches, orders that moved armies. Not his own commands, Hitler's will, written into paper and sent onward. The Reich's political stage had vanished. Only one defense remained, his own version of events. The protocol sat between them, so did the silence. The questioning tested that version line by line, and the contradictions surfaced fast. Jodl still held to innocence at the end. That claim did not stay inside one man's biography. It reached into the way historians read the Third Reich's command structure.
The answer begins with one office inside OKW, the Armed Forces High Command of the Wehrmacht. Alfred Jodl led its operations staff. That put him at the center of the top briefings, beside Hitler, where spoken demands became written orders. He did not just pass papers down the chain. Jodl turned Hitler's directions, even conflicting ones, into commands the armed forces could carry out. Decisions made with his help reached across entire countries. In the Reich's military leadership, he stood near the top. Outside Germany's highest circles, his name barely registered. He kept his anonymity by design, and he never tried to sell himself to the public. He preferred the shadows of authority. He chose quiet over display. The army was his country. Orders came before everything else. His path ran through war and crisis, and each stage kept him inside the military world. He was not a performer like Goering, and not a propagandist like Goebbels. Born in 1890 in Bavaria, the son of a military officer, he carried that background with soldier's pride. He served in the First World War with distinction, then survived Weimar's fractured politics as a career officer. By the time the Nazis took power, he had tied himself fully to military service, and ideology looked unnecessary. He chose to serve that regime. That choice later became the real issue, and the later case turned on complicity or obedience, not on the uniform. No one could call it drift. The record pointed back to choice. That choice now had a date. By April 1945, the Reich that had looked invincible a decade earlier was collapsing fast. Soviet forces closed on Berlin from the east, while American and British armies had already crossed the Rhine. Jodl kept holding briefings over maps, even as German-held territory shrank hour by hour. The collapse moved faster than the maps could update. In the bunker, Hitler still issued orders to armies that no longer existed. Then, he shot himself on April 30th. The command kept moving on paper. Reality had already broken through. Within days, the surviving Nazi leadership was scrambling for terms with the Allies. Jodl traveled to Reims and signed the unconditional surrender of all German armed forces on May 7, 1945. The signing took place in SHAEF headquarters, inside a school building, in the small red schoolhouse in Reims. Through his interpreter, he said the German people and the German armed forces had achieved and suffered more than perhaps any other people in history. The Allied officers in the room showed no sympathy. On May 23, 1945, they arrested Jodl with the Flensburg leadership. That signature became evidence. Within weeks, Jodl was in Nuremberg. There, the paper from Reims no longer closed the matter. Older orders did. By the summer of 1945, investigators had placed him in the prison beside the Palace of Justice and started laying out directives, initials, and command lines. The tribunal opened on November 20, 1945, and the public saw judges, translators, and a fixed record. The interrogations were different. They happened in small rooms. Mostly American officers led them, though British officers appeared too, and they came armed with folders, signatures, and dates. Colonel John Amon took part in the preliminary questioning and helped prepare the case. Jodl sat through those sessions in the fall and winter of 1945 and into 1946. He did not flare up. He did not deny the papers. He argued over what each order meant, who signed below him, and how far duty ran through the chain of command. Goering performed, Ribbentrop sagged, and Keitel wept. Jodl stayed dry and official. By early 1946, the investigators had fixed the main point.
He was not disputing the documents, only translating them into the language of orders and duty.
One of the earliest and most significant admissions came when the interrogators pressed him about the so-called criminal orders. German command issued the Commissar Order on June 6, 1941, and it sat in his chain of command. The pages carried his signature, or the signatures of men directly beneath him in that chain. The invasion of the Soviet Union began on June 22, 1941, after the order was already on paper. Timing mattered inside the room. It ordered German forces to shoot captured Soviet political commissars, not treat them as prisoners of war. He did not deny knowing it, and he did not pretend the file had never reached his desk. He did not attack its authenticity. He called it military necessity, and he said the commissars posed a unique threat that justified extraordinary measures. In his version of an existential war, the normal rules had to bend, and he said that openly. Interrogators pushed back immediately. They pointed to the date. The order came before the invasion, before any alleged provocation by commissars. Jodl shifted slightly under pressure. Later, he called the order a mistake, not because it was morally wrong, but because it hardened Soviet resistance. The mistake for him was the result, because commissars knew they would be shot if captured and fought harder anyway. That defense hit another document. On October 18, 1942, Hitler issued the Commando Order. It told German commands to shoot Allied commandos captured behind German lines at once, outside the normal protections given to prisoners of war. Investigators then produced papers showing that the order had moved through Alfred Jodl's office. They also had evidence it was carried out. Again, he tried to recast guilt as bad judgment. Jodl did not dispute the document. He said he had warned Hitler that the order was legally doubtful and had raised objections before it went out. Then came the admission. He sent it on anyway, saying his duty was to transmit Hitler's decisions, not veto them from his desk. That answer exposed the contradiction. He stayed near power. He pushed blame away. Prosecutors saw the problem at once, because Jodl wanted the authority of a senior officer without the burden of the results. He placed himself inside the circle of decision, yet outside the guilt created when the order was enforced. That split damaged his whole defense. He was building a wider story too. In that story, the German officer corps stood apart from Nazi political leadership. Officers carried out orders with private reluctance, and the crimes belonged to Hitler alone. Answers like this fed the later legend of an uninvolved professional army. But the record stayed plain. He warned Hitler about the legal danger, and he still sent the order down the chain. That was not the whole picture. Jodl also carried the memory of Hitler's early wins. Norway, France, the Balkans. In his account, those campaigns mattered. Hitler overruled his generals. Then events often seemed to prove him right. For Jodl, that left a mark. By spring 1940 and again in 1941, the pattern was clear inside the headquarters. A man who kept winning made dissent feel costly. The room for argument narrowed fast. Jodl said Hitler had real tactical insight in those early campaigns. He also admitted the danger was not abstract. If Hitler had been right before, arguing again became harder. That earlier trust now carried a price. By 1943, Hitler had drifted away from strategic reality. By 1944, the danger reached daily decisions at headquarters. Jodl described briefings where Hitler rejected casualty reports. Officers brought loss figures. Hitler refused them. He demanded counterattacks from divisions that existed only on paper. Any proposal to retreat became cowardice or treason. The break with reality was no longer hidden. The interrogators moved straight to responsibility. What did Jodl do with that knowledge? The question now was simple. Why stay? Why not resign? Why not push back harder? Jodl answered in plain language. He said resignation was no real option. It would change nothing. Another officer would take his place. If he stayed, he could still blunt some orders. That claim became the center of his defense. Investigators recorded that defense in plain terms. He remained because he believed his presence could still soften decisions. That defense pushed the interrogation into a narrower line. Investigators moved from motive to decisions, naming Barbarossa, the Balkans, North Africa, and the split of German forces on the Eastern Front in 1942. They did not ask whether he had influence in theory. They asked what crossed his desk, what his staff prepared, and what role he took in each decision. Under that pressure, Jodl admitted that he had been present for virtually every major strategic decision of the war from 1939 onward. The Soviet campaign mattered most in that exchange. Jodl acknowledged that the planning for the invasion of the Soviet Union had gone through his staff, and that he knew from the start how wide and destructive the campaign was meant to be, including the stated intent to wage a war of annihilation against the Soviet state. Investigators then narrowed the point again and asked whether, during the planning stage, he understood that the orders in preparation would bring mass civilian deaths. He answered with caution, saying war brought civilian losses and that, on the Eastern Front, military action and atrocity could merge. The record still kept the central admission. Barbarossa passed through his staff, and he stood near almost every major decision of the war. After Barbarossa, the prosecutors narrowed the question to food on occupied Soviet land. The frame got tighter. They asked Jodl about the hunger plan, a German policy that stripped those territories of food, while German planners accepted the deaths of tens of millions of civilians. Jodl denied knowing the plan as a formal directive. That was his line. But he could not deny what followed from it, because he sat through the briefings, read the reports, and remained at his desk while the policy moved from paper to orders. The interrogators had more than suspicion. They had documents. In the transcript, they pressed the contradiction in plain terms. He knew what was happening. He stayed in post, and he signed orders that helped carry it forward. His defense still pointed back to duty and obedience. The record did not. It kept the harder split intact. Jodl denied the formal directive, but the papers tied him to the reports and the signatures. From the food papers, the prosecutors moved north. Norway, in spring 1940, was the campaign Jodl still treated as a staff success. Investigators put it on the table for that reason. He directly supervised Operation Weserübung. The invasion was complex, risky, and it worked. That mattered. Then the maps changed, occupation followed, and Norwegian civilians faced hostage-taking and arbitrary executions. Jodl took professional pride in the campaign, but the papers led past success and into repression. His command authorized hostage-taking, arbitrary executions, and terror in occupied Norway. The invasion map was gone. Now the table held orders. Interrogators placed specific reprisal directives before Jodl and tied several to his level of command. When Norwegian resistance units struck German forces, the retaliation in those papers often moved past the attackers and into civilian communities. Jodl answered with a familiar formula. He called the occupation a problem of pacification and said resistance had to be suppressed by military necessity. He insisted the measures were proportional. The interrogators answered from the file, not from theory. The documents cut through that defense. They showed that the reprisals did not stay on armed opponents, but fell on townspeople who had not carried out the attacks. In occupied territory, Jodl described the task as suppression. The orders showed where that logic led. The papers showed reprisals hit civilian communities, not resistance fighters. Those papers did more than trace reprisals. They lifted the case above single orders. Prosecutors moved from hostages and executions to conspiracy, a common plan to wage aggressive war. Under the Nuremberg Charter, signed in London that year before the trial opened, that charge belonged to crimes against peace. It stood apart from the later counts on war crimes and crimes against humanity. In 1945, that formula was new. Jodl fought this count hard. He said aggressive war had not been fixed in law before the war began. A soldier, he argued, could not be judged by a rule written after the alleged act. That was the center of his retroactivity claim. The point reached past Norway. Jodl said the Allies were turning the conduct of a defeated state into a new crime, while the victorious powers escaped the same scrutiny. He shifted the argument from what his orders did to who had the right to define the crime. Lawyers and historians would keep disputing that point. His defense then pushed further. The team prepared a brief on the Allied bombing of German cities, including the firebombing campaigns. Jodl presented it as a charge against the victors. The move did not answer the orders already on record. It tried to put the tribunal itself under accusation. The judges did not follow him there. They rejected the bombing brief, and they rejected the attempt to balance Allied air attacks against the charges before the court. For the court, the issue was not whether cities had burned. It was whether the defendants had joined and directed a war of conquest. The broader legal dispute never disappeared, but at Nuremberg, the tribunal closed that door. With the legal door closed, investigators returned to his own words and orders. After Norway, they matched what left Jodl's office to what he admitted in the room. By then, after the tribunal opened on November 20th, 1945, Jodl faced questions as chief of the OKW operations staff. Across dozens of sessions, his regrets stayed narrow. He spoke about faulty tactical decisions and about serving Hitler after Hitler's judgment had failed. He described what Germany had become in a distant official tone. That was the line. He almost never named the people hurt by the orders that crossed his desk. Millions of Soviet civilians barely entered his account. Nor did prisoners of war shot under orders that passed through his staff. Nor resistance fighters killed in reprisals, or civilians on occupied territory driven into hunger by policies he helped shape. He could discuss failures of command. He rarely discussed victims. By the end of the interrogations, the human cost of his decisions still stood almost outside his own version of the war.
So the examiner moved to the hardest subject: Soviet prisoners of war. Late in one session, he pressed Jodl on the men who died in German captivity. The losses were catastrophic. About 3 million Soviet POWs died there, mainly in 1941 and 1942. Jodl paused. Then he said he had not understood, at the time, the full scale of what was happening. The interrogator marked that hesitation in his summary and noted visible discomfort. It was the only such moment in that session. In the record, one rare note remained: visible discomfort. From the interrogation room, the case moved into judgment. On October 1, 1946, the International Military Tribunal found Alfred Jodl guilty on all 4 counts: conspiracy, crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. The sentence was death by hanging. In the early hours of October 16th, he was executed with 9 other condemned men. Asked the prison formula, he gave his name and rank, then said nothing more. With the hanging over, the dispute moved in the West German court papers. In 1953, a denazification court reopened Jodl's case after his death and issued a disputed acquittal. One claim was simple: he had obeyed orders as a soldier. Another claim treated aggressive war as retroactive law. But that court did not continue Nuremberg. Its judges were not the International Military Tribunal. Law said otherwise. The London Charter of 1945 did not erase guilt with one appeal to orders. The ruling drew protests in West Germany and abroad. Later jurists called its reasoning flawed. It was set aside. That leaves the interrogation transcripts at the center. In them, Alfred Jodl is not a symbol, but a staff officer under scrutiny. Since 1939, he had led the operations staff of the OKW, the Armed Forces High Command, where decisions at the top turned into written orders below. The record is dry, but the route is clear. Criminal directives moved through a chain of command, reached desks, took form on paper, and reached units that carried them out. Some of those decisions are still reduced to Hitler alone. The transcripts cut against that shortcut. One man did not wage a continent-wide war of annihilation by personal will alone. Senior officers turned intent into orders and sent them onward. Jodl did not present himself as a sadist, and the case against him never depended on that label. He spoke in the language of duty. He tied responsibility to execution, not to consequences, and he treated obedience as the edge of his task. That service record made him a central participant in criminal decisions, not a neutral technician beside them. By the end of the interrogations, the Nuremberg record fixes the point. Personal responsibility remained, and Jodl appears as an officer for whom carrying out an order had displaced judging the order itself. From that settled habit of self-justification came Nuremberg's sharpest legal answer. The judges heard the defense of superior orders and refused the claim that obedience ended the matter. They rejected it. Neither rank nor uniform erased guilt. Jodl did not offer that line as a sudden courtroom tactic. He believed it. The interrogation record shows repetition, not improvisation before judges. He had reached that answer long before Allied interrogators sat across from him. For decades, he carried that defense into his own judgment and repeated it unchanged. In 1950, the Nuremberg principles fixed the rule in writing. Principle 4 said it directly. An order from a superior did not remove responsibility when a moral choice remained possible. That is where Jodl's argument failed. After that ruling, only the tail of his excuse remains. Everything that followed was promotion. So the video ends there, without replacement.